exclusive video for Patreon. Thank you for your support as always. Today I'm going to cover the case of Donald Bez Jr. that's been requested for a while. I'm kind of giving it away from the beginning, but that's how the case was introduced to me. But it's one of those cold cases that was finally solved. Angie Samoda was a junior at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and she was studying computer science and electrical engineering. She was described as friendly and bubbly, kind of a people person. She was also very serious about school, and in her free time, she'd used to socialize. On the night of Saturday, October 13th, 1984, she invited friends, Anna and Russell, to join her on one of her favorite and popular night spots. Her boyfriend, Ben McCall, was also asked to join them, but he said that he couldn't because he had an early start at his construction job the next day. And they were like, okay, you're lost, you know. And they left it at that. So Angie, Anna, and Russell would make quite a night of it. And they ended up at the Rio Room, which is an exclusive members-only club. Angie, as I mentioned before, was kind of the life of the party. She would go table to table, laughing and talking with friends. But she was not really drinking. Her friends were, but she wasn't drinking much, because she had to drive back. She also had plans to go to this football game early the next morning. So at 1 a.m., they decided to call it a night after a fun night out. Angie dropped Russell off at his apartment, and she and Anna headed back to her place. Anna was supposed to sleep over, but at that point she changed her mind. She really didn't want to wake up early, because Angie had to go to this football game, so she asked Angie to drop her at her dorm room so she could sleep her the day away. Angie dropped her off and then stopped at her boyfriend's apartment to say goodnight. She stayed there only for a few minutes. Ben had barely dozed off again when the phone started ringing. Angie was on the line and she sounded very weird. She'd say, "Talk to me." She then started rambling on about something sounding jittery and stressed. He was confused, but when he was going to ask about what was wrong, he heard a noise in the background. And she said, "There's a man here." She said that this guy told her he needed to use the phone and the bathroom, and that she shouldn't have let him in. She said that on a whisper, but then raised her voice again. She asked if there was a payphone at the convenience store near her apartment. Ben said that there was, and heard Angie say this to the stranger inside her apartment. Then she said, Ben, I'll call you back, and hung up the phone. Ben waited for 5 long minutes, but then picked up the phone and dialed Angie's number. She was not answering. So Ben got dressed and ran down to his truck. He continued to call Angie's number, and as he was driving towards her apartment, Angie's building was just ahead of him. He slammed on the brakes and he entered the parking lot. He got out of the car and took the stairs, calling her name. Now Ben was in this state of, getting there. Then he remembered that she asked about the payphone. Maybe her line was down. Maybe she'd gone to the convenience store to call from there. It was hopeful thinking. So, when he checked, she wasn't at the store. So he returned to the apartment and banged on the door again. At that point, with no response, he called the police. They got there around 2:40 a.m. They asked for the key from the building manager, and they got into her apartment. They asked Ben to stay out in the corridor. One of the officers found her sprawled out nude across her bed. Her eyes were staring blankly at the ceiling, her upper torso covered in blood. Blood on the walls and the headboard, soaked into the bedding. They did the autopsy, and that's when they found out that she was stabbed 18 times, penetrating her lungs, her heart, and even one that nicked her spine. She was also raped. They had to reconstruct the crime. And one of the things that they realized is that the killer had been inside the apartment when Ben was banging on the door. They believed that he was probably assaulting Angie at the time. They believed that maybe Angie had tried to call out and been stabbed to keep her quiet. Anyways, at this point the police assumed that the killer was somebody Angie knew. Lance Johnson was an ex-boyfriend who was briefly considered as a suspect, but his blood type didn't match the semen recovered from the scene. Joseph years SMU student who apparently had a crush on Angie had been asking her for a date, but he had an alibi. Ben McCall was also investigated, but his blood type ruled him out. They also looked into Russell, the guy that was with her out that night, and her friend Anna, but even he didn't have an alibi, and he could not be eliminated by blood type since he was a non-secretor. In the beginning, the investigators thought, well, this is the man. They believed that he showed up at her apartment later that night, talked his way in, that he tried to convince her to have sex with him, and when she refused, he did everything by force and ended up stabbing her to death. Well, this theory really doesn't make sense if you remember the phone call Angie had made to her boyfriend. If, in fact, this would have been Russell, she would have referenced to him by name, rather than saying that a man who wanted to use the phone in the bathroom is inside the apartment. The police had Russell under 24-hour surveillance for 6 months, interrogating him every once in a while, hoping for a confession. But eventually he hired a lawyer, and that's when the police backed off. The case went cold, and it remained cold for 20 years. In the year 2006, a private investigator, Sheila Wysocki, called the Dallas Police Department to ask about the unsolved homicide of Angela Samoda. Her involvement with the case was kind of deep. She was a friend and roommate of Angie's at SMU back in the day, and she was still obsessed with this because the killer walked on a case that, they had enough evidence to try to find him, according to her. The police was not really interested in her cold case investigation. And according to them, the rape kit had been lost during the flood of 1990, which destroyed any chance of DNA match. But she wasn't buying that. She kept bothering them. She later said that it took 700 calls before the police relented and assigned a detective to look into the matter. The detective was Linda Crum, and she soon discovered that the rape kit wasn't lost at all. It was filed away in an evidence room. They sent those to be tested, and they came back to a match to a serial rapist named Donald Andrew Bess Jr., who was, by the way, serving a life term in Huntsville. He had been convicted of 3 violent sexual assaults. he was seen fit to set him free after he'd served less than a quarter of his sentence. So he embarked in this renewed campaign of sexual violence against women. And Angie ended up paying the price. This generous parole board. It was brought to trial in June of 2010 and found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to die by lethal injection. He was waiting at the Polanski unit in Huntsville. For Angie Samota's sentence of death has already been enacted. She's buried at Llano Cemetery in Amarillo, Texas. Now, I've been reading quite a lot of these cases in this book, of cold cases that were finally solved. And I find so interesting that sometimes, it's right there. The answer is right there. The suspect is either in custody already, or was a suspect at some point. And I can't help but wonder how many people that are actually guilty are walking the streets and living their lives like if nothing happened. If this guy was, being held accountable for what he did and not even given the option of parole, he wouldn't have done what he did to Angie. A bright girl doing all the right things, going to school, being social. What are we missing in our system? Room. People. What are we missing? This was one of those cases that, none of them should happen, but what are we doing over here, What are we doing? It just leaves me speechless to know that these things happen. And that these people committing some of these crimes are repeat offenders, doing this under our noses and then making it almost impossible to catch them. Frustrating, it's the least of what I'm thinking right now. The word that comes to mind. Thank you so much for being here today, guys. I appreciate your support. I'm hoping to go little by little through all you guys' suggestions for cases, and this was one of them. I'm glad he was caught. I'm glad somebody insisted on this case. I'm glad that that kid was not lost. But still, lives is empty without Angie in this world. I'll talk to you guys next time.